This is the former site of 271 Victoria Dock Road in North Woolwich. Now the site of the new Custom House train station, this was once the location of a 19th century pub called the Barge. Throughout its life, the Barge was a popular drinking spot for the workforce of the River Thames barges. Opening in 1862, it remained here for 140 years. It was renamed the Kilkenny Castle in the mid-1980s and closed its doors in 2002 before becoming low-cost accommodation. In 2014 it was demolished, along with a row of neighbouring buildings, before the site was completely modernised. But let's go back 95 years to 1931, when a young man walked into the Old Barge pub during its heyday. It was the morning of Saturday the 28th of November, when 25-year-old William Harold Goddard bought a pint of beer from long-time landlord Robert Bruton. William Goddard was new to the area. Originally from Ipswich, he had moved to London in 1930 to work as a Thames barge hand on the North Woolwich shore. Goddard took his pint, sat down and nursed it for 3 hours before leaving. A while later he returned and ordered another pint of beer, but explained that he had no way of paying. He asked for a credit of 10 shillings, then pulled a gold watch and chain from his pocket, handed it over and asked if it could be used as security until payday. Landlord Robert Bruton thought it a strange request. Payday for the bargeman was yesterday. Besides, the watch and chain were clearly worth a great deal more than a few beers. He thought it odd that Goddard would make the offer so casually, but accepted it. William Goddard proceeded to drink on his credit until 10 p.m. The following day, Robert Bruton opened his pub as usual. The typically large Sunday crowd was there, except for one regular, a man named Charles Lambert. 57-year-old Lambert was a skipper of a barge called the Speranza, moored at the North Woolwich shore. He had been a regular at Bruton's establishment for the last 40 years. In fact, Robert Bruton thought, he had probably been in every weekend since then. So on Monday, which was usually quiet, Bruton walked down to the Thames where the Speranza barge was berthed. He climbed aboard and found it locked, with no sign of his faithful customer. On the same day, 60 miles northeast, a distressed William Goddard, accompanied by his brother Percy, entered the Ipswich Borough Police Station. They were greeted by their good friend, Detective Constable Sedgley Foster. William Goddard told Foster that he was worried about the skipper of a barge in London, a man named Charles Lambert, who he had worked for. He said, "Something happened there. It's to do with the skipper." When pressed for more information, a suddenly penitent William Goddard went on, "I have come to give myself up for murder. I killed the skipper of the Speranza on Saturday. I wish to make a statement." William explained that there had been an argument on the barge which resulted in him hitting Lambert with a hammer, but it was in retaliation, he said. Lambert had hit him with the hammer first, before he wrestled it away from him. He went on, "The blows I gave him made him fall into the cabin. He was moaning, and that made me think I should finish him off. I then covered him with a blanket." A police officer inspected Goddard's neck and found what he described as a small lump. At some point during their time at Ipswich Police Station, William and Percy Goddard were joined by their sister Alice, their other brother and his wife. William asked them all to pass a message on to his mother that there was no hope for him. He had already paid her a visit that day on Kemp Street, telling her that he had some trouble back in London, but he didn't go into detail. After receiving word from police in Ipswich, North Woolwich Police headed down to the Thames, which despite it being just after midday, was engulfed in freezing fog. The barge, as Goddard had said, was moored at the North Woolwich Causeway. It was locked up, but the keys were found in an open locker. On entering the Speranza, they were faced with the bloodied, contorted body of Charles Lambert in a cabin bunk. He was on his back, his hands were clenched tightly together and his legs were pulled up. He was partially covered in clothes and a blanket. Detective Inspector Alexander Lawrence, who oversaw the investigation, found a blood-stained knife on a table, and in the bunk bed opposite there was a bloodied shirt and a writing pad. On it was a note which read, "I have done this out of temper. He has sold his watch and chain for beer. If I'm caught, may God help me." Alongside the note was a piece of blotting paper with 2 Ipswich addresses written on it. One was Kemp Street, where Goddard had lived with his mother and brother, and the other was Kemble Street, the home of William Goddard's fiancée, Phyllis Wood. In an eerie scene, it was reported that a large crowd had gathered at the North Woolwich Causeway as Detective Lawrence and his team wandered the Speranza. The onlookers were attracted by the police torches and watched intently as the body of Charles Lambert was removed, placed in a funeral car and taken to East Ham Mortuary. Charles Lambert had suffered multiple severe head injuries and skull fractures. He had bled a great deal, and there was a rope tied around his neck in a double knot. There were also several stab wounds about his body, made with a small blade. His protruding tongue was proof that the rope had accelerated his death, according to medical examiner Dr. Richard Bruce, who said that Lambert had fallen into a coma before the rope was tied. It appeared that, as there was no sign of a struggle within the cabin, the fight must have taken place outside. Charles Lambert, Mr. Bruce said, had been dead for approximately 48 hours. William Goddard was then accompanied by a police officer to London by train. During the journey, he told the officer, "I don't want to cause you any unnecessary trouble. I just want to tell you that the hammer I did it with, I threw overboard." Goddard was held at Brixton Prison, where he gave a statement. He said that on Saturday the 28th of November, his skipper, Charles Lambert, had gone into the city to collect some letters. When he asked Lambert if there were any for him, he replied, "Yes, there's a letter here from your old whore," referring to William Goddard's fiancée, Phyllis. This, Goddard said, sent him into a rage. He went to hit Lambert, but as he did, the older man fell down the cabin stairs. Goddard followed him to see how he was, but found him brandishing the coal hammer. According to William Goddard, Lambert hit him with the hammer on the back of the head and neck. He said that he wrestled the hammer away and hit him with it, which is when Lambert fell to the ground. He was severely injured but still alive, William said, but he was making so much noise that he had to finish him off. He did so by tying a rope around his neck and then covered him with a blanket. He had considered throwing him overboard as it was foggy on the Thames and he could have done so without being seen, but decided against it. While speaking to a doctor at Brixton Prison, Goddard spoke of his past life troubles. He tried to take his own life in 1929 by cutting his throat. That had left a scar 2.5 inches long. William said, "It was all down to drink and women trouble. I never had it treated in hospital. I dealt with it myself." He also had 5 previous charges of theft and a history of drunkenness. The inquest into the death of Charles Lambert was opened in East Ham on Thursday the 3rd of December 1931. William Goddard did not attend, but the estranged brother of his victim, William Lambert, made the journey from his home in Nottingham. Although he said he hadn't seen him for 4 years, he said his brother was a good man with no enemies. He recognised the gold watch and chain as belonging to his brother. So too did a man named James Christopher Hopcraft, a jeweller from Grays, Essex, who said that he had been handed the watch for repair by Charles Lambert on several occasions. William Goddard originally pleaded not guilty on the 11th of December 1931 at East Ham Police Court. When he was shown the watch and chain that he had stolen from Mr. Lambert and used as credit at the Barge pub, he insisted that they belonged to him. 1 month later, he appeared at the historic Old Bailey courts and faced Judge Justice Finlay. It was the 19th of January 1932. Goddard, who had been granted counsel under the Poor Persons Defence Act, changed his plea to manslaughter due to the provocation of Charles Lambert's derogatory remarks about his fiancée. He told the court that he had killed Charles Lambert at around 3:30 p.m. on Saturday the 28th of November, shortly after he had left the Barge pub. To the surprise of the court, William Goddard received support from his friend, Detective Constable Sedgley Foster, who said he knew William and his fiancée Phyllis well. He told the court, "When in drink, Goddard is a very quick-tempered man, but he has been walking out with her for 2 years. She is a respectable girl, and the remark alleged to have been made about her by Captain Lambert would certainly not apply to her. She has stuck with him all through his trouble." The defence counsel, Gerald Howard, told the jury, "Goddard was engaged to a girl he loved and she loved him. How could he have held back his hand when such an objectionable expression was used about her? Is there any man who would not think it a shame on his manhood?" Judge Finlay disagreed. He said that even if William was outraged by the remark, that's if the remark was even made in the first place, there was no need to retaliate with a hammer followed by a rope. He added that it was more likely that Goddard wanted the watch and chain so that he could buy alcohol with it. The trial lasted 2 days. On the 20th of January 1932, William Goddard was convicted of murder. He calmly accepted his death sentence, and when asked if he had anything to say, he simply replied, "Nothing." There was no recommendation for mercy. A petition with over 5,000 names on it requesting a reprieve for William Goddard was received by the Home Office, but it was unsuccessful. The London newspaper News Chronicle received 10 shillings from an anonymous reader who requested that it be used to Goddard's advantage, but there was no record of how or if it was used. On the 23rd of February 1932 at 9 a.m, William Goddard became one of the 120 men hanged at Pentonville Prison. His executioner was Robert Baxter. There were reportedly no friends or family standing outside the prison gates for Goddard, but strangers stood in silence, hats removed. Charles Lambert was an experienced bargeman of 30 years from Grays, Essex. His funeral had taken place several weeks before Goddard's execution. He is buried at the City of London Cemetery, just 4 miles north of where he was killed. Many wreaths were received from friends and family, including one from the Grays Workingmen's Club. 5 family members attended his service. In September of 1873, a pathologist invited members of the public into the Wandsworth Clapham Union Workhouse in South London to help identify the body, or should I say body parts, of a woman who had been found along a 13-mile stretch of the River Thames. Dr. Kempster's grotesque exhibit had been sewn together by Francis Seymour Hayden, a prominent London surgeon, to resemble as much as possible a human form. The grotesque collection of limbs was attached to a metal frame, which was crowned with a mannequin's head, on which the skin of the woman's face and cranium was applied. Between 50 and 60 people over the course of nearly 2 weeks came to view the grim spectacle. 3 days earlier, at 6:30 a.m, 36-year-old Richard Fane of the Thames Police, along with 2 of his colleagues, were heading west on the river towards Chelsea Bridge, formerly Victoria Bridge. The tide was low, and as they passed the Battersea Waterworks to their left, they saw something. Richard Fane explained. "I observed something on the shore, about 3 or 4 yards from the water. I put the boat ashore and told one of my brother officers to get out and see what it was. He went to it and then called me to come and see it. I saw that it was a portion of a woman's body, that being the left breast." They had in fact found the entire left side of a woman's torso. Officer Fane took the body part to police surgeon Dr. Felix Kempster. Kempster's first report after examining the part included the following entry. "Death has taken place within a few hours. The head, arm and other side of the thorax and rest of the body have been separated by a knife and saw, and in an unscientific manner. The body has not been dissected for anatomical purposes, but has been cut up immediately after death." 4 hours after Richard Fane's discovery at Battersea, 1 mile downstream, Constable Henry Locke of the South Western Railway Police found the right portion of the torso close to the old Nine Elms train station. With the help of a nearby boatman, he managed to bring it ashore. A portion of the Thames was dredged and netted, and police officers up and down the river made searches on foot. On Saturday the 6th of September at 6:45 a.m, 31-year-old Constable John Parker was attracted to a crowd gathering at the riverside at Limehouse. At first he thought they were looking at a mask, but when he edged closer he could barely believe what he was seeing. With only a small fragment of skull attached, It was the skin of a human cranium and face, almost completely intact, ears and all. The right side of the mouth and chin were the only parts missing. The nose was cut away at the cartilage and was hanging on by the skin of the top lip. On the 8th of September, the right thigh was found near Woolwich, and the right shoulder and part of the arm, which was smeared with tar, was found near Greenwich. All the body parts were sewn together by the surgeon Francis Hayden and displayed at the Wandsworth Clapham Union Workhouse boardroom for the inquest, which opened on the same day and was presided by pathologist Dr. Kempster and William Carter, the coroner for East Surrey. Dr. Kempster believed the woman to have been about 40 years old. There was a scar on the left breast from an old burn, and she wore several earrings. There was no major internal organs present, and the arteries were void of blood. He also wrote how the facial skin had been separated from the skull in an unskilled manner. Dr. Kempster wrote, "The integument has been separated from the bone with a sharp implement and was cut irregularly in several places. The head was covered in short, dark, very thin hair. The eyebrows are dark, and there is a very thin, dark moustache. The ears were somewhat coarse and pierced for earrings. The end of the nose has been severed from the root and is attached to a portion of the upper lip." From looking at the sculpted cranium and face, he could see that the victim had suffered a blow to the temple shortly before death, but he couldn't say for sure if this was the cause of death. It was early days, and police were still searching for body parts, so the inquest was adjourned for a week to allow further investigation. On the 9th of September, the right thigh and right forearm were found on the Thames shore at Battersea, while the left forearm was found at the Albert Bridge. The next day, the pelvis was found on the bank of Royal Arsenal in Woolwich, while the left thigh and lower part of the trunk were also located in Battersea. A foot and the right forearm were found near Lambeth and Rotherhithe. After Dr. Kempster expressed his conviction that all parts had come from the same body, photographs were taken of the sewn-up parts, but these were not made available to the public. People were, however, invited to the Battersea workhouse to identify the woman, but they were warned by Dr. Thomas Bond, a surgeon for the Metropolitan Police. He said, "Identification is only possible to those who have been intimately acquainted with the physical characteristics of the deceased. For notwithstanding the integrity and skill with which Mr. Hayden has carried out my suggestions in sewing together the pieces and in fitting the skin of the face as naturally as possible to the barber's block, the features are entirely destroyed." One elderly man from Bermondsey was sure that it was his daughter Eliza Wood. He said that the young woman had fallen for a violent man years earlier. He hadn't seen her since and feared that she had been murdered. But Eliza had suffered from smallpox and the dead woman had not. Eliza Wood was later found safe and well on Waterloo Road, her identity confirmed by police. A man from Hoxton thought that it might be his 39-year-old daughter who had been missing for 3 weeks. He said she disappeared while her husband was attending his mother's funeral and had recently taken to drink, so the family were concerned about what might have happened to her. There were several physical similarities, said her father, but no identification was made. A woman from Southampton came to London suspecting the victim was her missing sister. She noted some similarities, but not enough to confirm it. A bargeman named Mr. Bignell, who was known to be a violent man, was followed after he was heard arguing with his wife and threatening to kill her aboard their barge. The barge, which was named the Anne, was followed to Rochester, Crawford and Gravesend. In the end, Mrs. Bignell was found on board, alive and well. An argument between a man and a woman outside the Boylow Arms pub near Hammersmith Bridge caught the attention of one Thomas Barnes. Barnes said the man struck the woman several times and she was heard screaming for the police. As Mr. Barnes was the only witness to this, the investigation went nowhere. Then there was a man named Mr. Hackman who said the dead woman looked like Mrs. Carter, a friend of his who lived on the Strand. She was in a desperately unhappy marriage, and he'd heard her say on more than one occasion that she wished her husband was dead. Carter wondered if a plan to kill him had backfired. Another theory claimed that William Bisgrove, a patient at Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum, killed the woman. On the 12th of July 1873, he became Broadmoor's first murderer to escape and evade capture. The police, however, ridiculed the idea. No clothing was found with any of the body parts. They were thought to be likely sold, burnt or buried. On the 16th of September, a £200 reward was offered for information leading to the killer, with a pardon promised to any accomplice who came forward. The inquest resumed that same day. Dr. Kempster gave additional descriptive information. He said that the dead woman had been thick-set and broad. She was moderately dark-skinned, had once given birth, and was in perfect health when she died. He again pointed out the bruise to the side of her head, which he now said likely killed her. He reiterated that a saw and a knife were used to cut her up, a task which, Kempster said, would have been extremely difficult for one person, but not impossible, and it certainly hadn't been done with any kind of precision. This went against a theory that a practical joke had been played by medical students who had disposed of a dissected corpse. Besides, it was clear that the body was a fresh kill and not a medical cadaver. The final verdict at the inquest was that the woman had been willfully murdered by some person or persons unknown. The most promising lead came when one Mrs. Christian, who was a landlady on South Street in Battersea, said that the description matched one of her tenants. The woman in question had lodged with her for over a year, but she had left owing £3 in rent. Mary Ann Cayley was her name. She was 38 years old and from Lyme Regis in Dorset. Some reports say that she came to London after her husband left her, while others wrote that she was a widow. She had told Mrs. Christian that she was going to a pawn shop and then to see a solicitor, but she never returned. Mrs. Cayley had reported a frightening experience a few weeks before. She had been attacked by 4 men late at night near Chelsea Bridge. The policeman who interviewed her doubted her story for 2 reasons. She was not robbed, and she was clearly drunk. They believed she may have fallen, injured herself, and then fabricated the story. The police said they remembered what she looked like and identified the stitched-up body as Mary Ann Cayley. When her landlady, Mrs. Christian, and another lodger friend, Mrs. Lawson, also identified her as the dead woman, it was accepted that poor Mary Ann Cayley had met a most horrible end. That was until Mary Ann's brother came forward and declared that the dead woman was not his sister. On the 17th of September, Mary Ann Cayley returned to London after a month in Scotland. She was taken to her former address and identified by Mrs. Christian. Mary Ann said she'd been with a man but refused to name him, and claimed that she'd only heard of the case of the dead woman on her return. By the end of September, not even a month after the first remains were found, further investigation was seen as pointless. A short summary of the closing of the case in the East Suffolk Gazette sums up the attitude. There is no longer any mystery about the Thames mystery. It was simply a horrid murder and butchery, the perpetrator of which is undiscovered. There is not, at the present time, anything to guide the police in their investigations, if indeed they are continuing them, which is very doubtful. Stories of found body parts run throughout the River Thames history. Less than a year after this case, another woman's torso was found in Putney, close enough in time to suggest a link. Of course, there's the famous Thames torso murders of 1887 to 1889, which happened 14 years later. Who's to say the same perpetrator or perpetrators weren't responsible? We've seen in our own lifetime serial killers who have been dormant for years before striking again. The skull, hands and a foot were never officially found. For me, this raises the question of the unidentified remains that have surfaced in the River Thames since then. In historical cases, if the remains were not identified, they were usually destroyed, leaving no way for us to test DNA. As with other such cases, the rest of her body may have been found, but we just don't know it's her. On the Victoria embankment of the Thames, between the Golden Jubilee Bridges and Waterloo Bridge, stands a red granite obelisk. Carved in Heliopolis, Egypt by Pharaoh Thutmose III in around 1450 BC, it is the oldest human-made structure in London. It was one of two obelisks that stood in Heliopolis but were then moved 100 miles northwest to the city of Alexandria and re-erected at the Temple of Caesareum. At some point in history it fell, and over centuries was covered in the shifting sands of the Mediterranean shore. In 1820 it was gifted to the British by Muhammad Ali, the ruler of Egypt, as a gesture to commemorate the British victories over the French at the Battle of the Nile in 1798 and the Battle of Alexandria in 1801. However, the British monarchy showed little interest in transporting the 186-ton object 3,000 miles due to the cost involved. In 1867, General Sir James Alexander urged the government to bring the obelisk to Britain, arguing that it was a gift, so a national duty to accept it. After a decade-long campaign, he ultimately appealed to the British public. Finally, in 1877, Erasmus Wilson, a renowned surgeon, offered to pay for the transportation. He entrusted John Dixon, a railway civil engineer, with the task, at a cost of approximately £10,000. The plan was to tow the obelisk within a carefully designed wrought iron cylinder. Benjamin Baker, later Sir Benjamin Baker, and the president of the British Institute of Civil Engineers, was tasked with building the barge-like vessel. London-based Thames Ironworks made the prefabricated parts, which were shipped to Egypt and constructed around the obelisk in Alexandria. The 92-foot-long, 15-foot-wide craft was aptly named the Cleopatra. After some delays, including stern damage requiring several days' repair, the vessel finally launched on the 8th of September 1877. Towed by two tugboats and crewed by Captain Henry Carter and 6 Maltese men, the Cleopatra was taken a short distance to the port of Alexandria, where she underwent a modification. A main deck with a trapdoor that led to the crew's quarters was added, as well as a catwalk that ended with a small turret. The turret had a dual purpose. It was to act as a position to communicate with the crew of the towing ship, as well as a wave breaker. As for the towing ship, John Dixon had secured a vessel worthy of pulling the obelisk west, across the Mediterranean and Alboran seas, through the Strait of Gibraltar, into the North Atlantic, and up to the English Channel. The Olga was a Liverpool-based 251-foot steel-hulled steamboat. It was due to make its journey back to England with a cargo of grain. For the price of £900, the captain of the Olga, a man named Booth, agreed to take the Cleopatra as far as Falmouth in Cornwall, at which point a tugboat would take her to the Thames estuary and into London. John Dixon's brother, Wayneman Dixon, joined the Olga's crew. The Cleopatra left the port of Alexandria on the 21st of September, towed by thick steel cables. Communication with the Olga was achieved with a chalkboard in good weather or a speaking horn. At night, pre-arranged messages were communicated through coloured lights. The second leg of the journey began badly. Almost immediately, one of Captain Carter's crew fell ill and remained confined to his cabin. He was Carter's second in command, so it was now Carter who had to stay on deck, monitor conditions and communicate with the Olga, sleeping only when possible in fair weather. Soon after, another man was bedridden with a foot injury, leaving 5 effective crew. The Cleopatra lay low in the water and pitched violently at times, but remained intact and moving forward. There was a negative mood on board, but the next few days brought fair weather. The crew became accustomed to the Cleopatra's pitching movement and appeared at ease. Good progress was being made. Every 6 hours, regardless of conditions, Captain Carter would go down into the interior of the Cleopatra. Holding a candle as he went, he crawled over and under the obelisk, checking for leaks and making sure the wooden frame was keeping the obelisk in place. On Monday the 24th of September, higher winds came in from the west. The Cleopatra began to pitch deeper and more frequently. This lasted for several days. On September the 27th, when they passed the south of Malta, the crew asked Carter if they could port in Valletta for a while. Carter refused. He knew his men were tired and anxious and no doubt a little homesick, so he was worried that they would abscond once ashore. One night at around 10 o'clock, the crew of the Olga noticed a distress flare rise from the Cleopatra. This was followed by a light signal, meaning stop, assistance needed. The steel tow line's shackle had broken at the Cleopatra's end due to her violent pitching. The space between the two vessels was narrowed, while the steel line was reeled in. The Olga and the Cleopatra remained close until early light when the repair was made. As they continued west, the weather deteriorated further. They were battling high winds and swells close to the North African coast. The situation became so dire that Captain Booth of the Olga made the decision to pull into the port of Algiers to give his crew leave. The Cleopatra's crew was not granted shore leave by Carter. The next day, when the weather had cleared and it was time to sail, a member of the Cleopatra's crew almost lost his leg when it was caught up in a coil of heavy cable. Bleeding profusely, the man was taken to a hospital. While in Algiers, Wayneman Dixon wrote to his brother John. The letter included his observations of Carter, who was terribly anxious now that he was 3 men down and undertaking most of the duties on board the Cleopatra himself. On the 5th of October, Henry Carter wrote in his journal, "This is a most unpleasant night. The swell is high and confused, and the Olga seems determined to tow us through the water or under it. I wish you would break down, for the quick pitching motion is almost unbearable. 16 pitches per minute, each one sending the water over the hull fore and aft, and a good deal of spray overall. My bed and the foresail is saturated, and I walk about in preference to sitting below, where all is close, impure and hot." One night, Carter's crew ran to him shouting "Devil" when they saw St. Elmo's fire overhead during a storm. Being superstitious men, they now considered the Cleopatra a cursed vessel, and there were whispers of jumping ship as they drew closer to the narrow Strait of Gibraltar. On Sunday the 7th of October, they moored safely in Gibraltar, and Captain Carter, for a handsome sum, acquired 2 more crew members. After a good night's sleep, they left the next day and were soon heading north towards Portugal's Cape St. Vincent. On the 11th of October, they passed by Lisbon and the estuary of the Tagus River. The swell of the Atlantic was considerable, but the 2 vessels rode it out as they turned past the northern point of Spain and into the Bay of Biscay. In a few days, if nature was kind enough, they would be heading into the English Channel, but fate had other ideas. At 8 a.m. on the 14th of October, a great storm came in from the southwest, and for a good half an hour, the Olga and the Cleopatra were battered with high winds and sleet. Seabirds came to rest on the vessels as the wind rose to gale force, and the Cleopatra began to seesaw more violently than she had before. As the day drew on, the storm grew worse, bringing with it thunder and lightning. Carter wrote of the fear in his crew's eyes, as they felt great waves crashing over their craft. By now the signal lights used to communicate with the Olga had been washed away, and Carter and his men could feel and hear the Obelisk's wooden frame breaking up as the gigantic structure shifted violently. It was time for the men to leave the Cleopatra or die. The vessel did have a lifeboat, but when the 12 by 4 foot boat was lowered into the raging bay, it was swept beneath the Cleopatra and lost. Meanwhile, Captain Booth was edging as close to the Cleopatra as possible so he could attempt to make out what Carter's men were trying to communicate. Booth later wrote, "We slowed engines and got as close as possible to make out what was wrong, but we were unable to distinguish what was said, signals of stress continuing and also shouting. The gale taking off a little, we made out, foundering, send a boat." A lifeboat was sent from the Olga with the daunting task of a rescue. Crew members William Askin, James Gardner, Joseph Benbow, Michael Burns, William Donald and William Petan rode into the darkness. Booth wrote that he saw his men reach the Cleopatra, so it looked promising. By 11 p.m. they had not returned, but as there was no sound of distress, he was hopeful that the men had been saved and that the lifeboat was safely latched to the side of the Cleopatra. But this couldn't have been further from the truth. An attempt was made by the Cleopatra crew to throw a line to the lifeboat. At first they caught it, but the lifeboat was being tossed around so violently in the swell that they lost grip of the rope. The lifeboat was then dragged past the Cleopatra as a second attempt was being made. As the rescue team disappeared into the unforgiving storm, a giant wave bore down on the lifeboat and its 6 men. Unaware of what had happened, the Olga pulled up as close to the Cleopatra as possible. At 2 a.m. the 2 vessels were meters apart. A second lifeboat was dropped into the water, and with the help of a rope, all men from the Cleopatra were rescued. The horrific episode had spanned 6 hours, and although they were all exhausted, it was agreed that an attempt would be made to search for the lost men, no matter how unlikely their survival. So the apparently doomed Obelisk was cut free from the Olga. For 3 hours, the 8 remaining men searched the path that they believed the lifeboat would have taken had it survived the wave. Oars and a boat hook were found, but there was no sign of life. They then attempted to return to the Cleopatra, but there was nothing but debris from the catwalk and turret. It was strongly believed that she had sunk. With great reluctance and heavy hearts, the men on board the Olga set sail again for Falmouth, England. They reached their destination on Wednesday the 17th of October. Waiting for the arrival of his brother and the rest of the Olga's crew was John Dixon, the man who had arranged the voyage. He had already received a telegram saying that the Olga had been seen from the English coastline without the Cleopatra in tow. When they arrived in port, Dixon rushed on board and was relieved to see Carter and his men, whom he feared had lost their lives. Tragically, awaiting the arrival of William Askin, one of the doomed rescue team, was a telegram from his wife announcing the birth of their first child. At the suggestion of John Dixon, a fund was set up to provide for the families of the lost men, all of whom came from Liverpool. Dixon himself donated £250. A plaque was later erected as a memorial to those men at the base of the Needles pedestal. Many believed the Cleopatra and her obelisk were lost at sea, but Captain Carter and her builder Benjamin Baker were confident that she had survived the storm. 4 days later, the Glasgow steamship Fitzmaurice, en route to Valencia, found the Cleopatra in the Bay of Biscay. After several hours of effort, she was secured and towed to Ferrol, Spain. From there, the paddle tug Anglia brought her to the Thames, arriving at the estuary on the 21st of January 1878. The monument was finally erected on the Victoria Embankment on the 12th of September 1878 and named Cleopatra's Needle. The needle has 2 Egyptian-style bronze sphinxes either side of it. Designed by English architect George John Vulliamy, they were meant to face outwards as if guarding the monument, but they were wrongly installed. The damage that can be seen at the base of the monument is from a World War I bomb that detonated on the road next to it minutes before midnight on the 4th of September 1917. Some say the obelisk is cursed, a belief brought on by stories of people who have taken their lives here by jumping into the river. Some believe that those poor souls were drawn to their deaths by a pharaoh's curse. 2 ghost stories are associated with the site. An apparition of a naked man has allegedly been seen running from behind Cleopatra's Needle and jumping into the river, leaving no splash. Sightings began shortly after its installation, leading to speculation that it's the ghost of one of the men who died in the Bay of Biscay. The other ghost story is one I told in my 2022 video, Ghost Stories of London 2. Taggs Island is situated on the River Thames at Hampton Court in the borough of Richmond-on-Thames. It was here in the early 20th century that the once famous Casino Hotel had its heyday. Designed by Frank Matcham and built between 1912 and 1913 by Fred Carno, the Casino was a luxurious hotel resort for the wealthy and famous. Its popularity began to decline as early as the 1920s, but it wasn't until 1971 that it was demolished. This is where our next tragic story unfolds, but let's for a moment travel almost 600 miles north to the Scottish town of Elgin. From 1902, this was the childhood home of Dorothy Hay Dinwoodie, the daughter of respected clergyman L. M. Hay Dinwoodie. From a young age, all sports, particularly tennis and motor racing, played a major role in her life. In fact, it was her love of sport that brought her and her future husband, Alexander Smale, together. The young Englishman, a naval officer, moved to Elgin as a student of motoring. Eventually he left education to open a car hire company in the Scottish town. He was soon to cross paths with young Dorothy while they were at a golf course at Lossiemouth, a few miles north of Elgin. According to friends, it was love at first sight, but in 1923, ill health overshadowed the lovers' lives when Dorothy became ill with tuberculosis. However, she made a recovery in 1924. They were married in Aberdeenshire, Scotland on the 20th of February that year and moved to the town of Esher, a suburb just outside southwest London. 3 months later, on the 21st of May, they took their beloved 23-horsepower white Delage to Hampton Court to meet with friends Oliver Bellingham Smith, famous racing car driver Tommy Hann, and hotel owner Miss Golland. They went to the shore of the Thames and crossed over the small stretch of water on a ferry to Tag's Island, where they spent the evening dancing and dining at the casino. They left just before midnight to board the ferry back to the North Shore. Alexander Smale drove the car onto the ferry. Next to him was Dorothy and Tommy Hann. In the back were Oliver Bellingham Smith, Miss Golland and Dorothy's Alsatian named Wolf. As the ferry reached the other side of the 53-metre stretch of water, the car suddenly shifted and quickly rolled back, breaking the ferry's safety chain and dropping off the stern. Vertical in the water, it quickly sank into the Thames, all 6 occupants still on board. Oliver Bellingham Smith and Miss Golland quickly exited the car through an already open window. Tommy Hann, real name Albert Percy Hann, said that he reached over to Dorothy Smale, but he could not feel her, so he swam out of the window thinking that she had escaped with her husband. Tommy Hann came to the surface and got the attention of the crew of a small boat. Staff members from the casino heard the commotion and ran to the river's edge. Kitchen worker Tom Davies dove in to help. When the commotion was over and Mr. Bellingham Smith, Mr. Hann, Miss Golland and Alexander Smale were pulled to safety with the help of the crew of 2 small boats, they soon realised that Dorothy Smale was not amongst them. Dorothy's dog could be heard howling and whining pitifully as he kept returning to the spot the car had submerged with his beloved owner. As Miss Golland watched over a barely conscious Alexander Smale, Bellingham Smith and Tommy Hann dove for an hour in an earnest search for their missing friend, but it was useless. Bellingham Smith even found the courage to re-enter the car, swim into it and out the other side, but he was swimming into a black void, already exhausted. A few moments later he resurfaced with the remark, "No, I am done for." It quickly dawned on everyone that this was no longer a rescue mission. The police arrived and ordered the lockkeeper at Molesey Lock, which was 600 metres east, to open the sluice gate to lower the water level. The car wasn't raised until 5 a.m. On the floor of the white Delage was the body of Dorothy Smale. 2 days later, on Saturday the 24th of May, an inquest into the tragedy was headed by coroner Dr. Reginald Kemp. A pathologist named Dr. A.D. Owen had examined the body of Mrs. Smale less than 2 hours after she was retrieved from the river. He noted that she had died of heart failure due to the shock of the incident. There was no sign whatsoever of drowning, he said, but her lungs were in an advanced stage of tuberculosis and she would not have lived much longer. Oliver Bellingham Smith recalled at the inquest that there had been a problem with the gears of the car earlier in the day, but that had been repaired, he said. Alexander Smale explained that he was not a good swimmer and he was sober that night. He said, "The car appeared to move backwards and I saw water coming up into the window. It was all done in a minute. I got out of the window, my brake was on and I had switched off the engine." Passenger Tommy Hann said, "I was surprised when the car moved back. It dropped at the stern and then sank in a vertical position. It was totally submerged and there was about 3 feet of water on top of it. My first thought was to open the door, which I did by putting my hand out of the window, unlocking the door and pulling it against the force of the water. I put my hand out to feel Mrs. Smale and felt nothing at all. When I came to the surface, the car appeared to be still sinking. it may have been running backwards into a deeper part of the river. When the car was raised, it was found that the gear stick was stuck between first gear and reverse, and the handbrake was on. It was agreed that the car was likely in reverse and the handbrake faulty, unbeknownst to Mr. Smale, and all it took was a little acceleration to take it over the edge. The coroner recommended to the ferrymaster George LeBourne that a more secure safety device such as iron bars be put in place. He also commended Tommy Han and Oliver Bellingham Smith for their brave efforts in attempting to rescue the 23-year-old Dorothy Smale. A verdict of accidental death was recorded. On hearing the news of his beloved daughter's death by telegram, Canon Hayden Woody told a London journalist for the Daily Mail that the news was too terrible for words. Having lost his wife only 3 years ago, he expressed an overwhelming sadness. Dorothy was quickly brought back to her hometown of Elgin. Many people were said to have lined the streets at her funeral, which took place at the Holy Trinity Church, of which her father was the rector, on Monday the 26th of May 1924, just 5 days after her passing. I hope you enjoyed this video. There are a few well-known stories I haven't included in this series, such as the Princess Alice disaster of 1878, which I am covering in a separate dedicated video. The other obvious ones are the Torso murders of 1887 to 1889 and the 2001 story of Adam. These cases have already been covered very well by other channels, so if you're interested in learning about these stories, I have left links in the video description. Thank you for all your support, and especially to my members whose names are listed here. I will see you again in the not so distant future.